Today we're going to dive into a really strange interruption in the book of Ezekiel. I mean, it seems totally out of place, but this one chapter, it ends up unlocking this huge puzzle about how we understand prophecy and the future itself.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We're deep in the book of Ezekiel, and for 32 long chapters, it has been all about judgment against Israel. But then, finally, the tone starts to shift. In chapter 34, there's this promise of a new leader, a good shepherd. Hope is finally on the horizon. But just as we're getting into this optimistic new direction, bam! Chapter 35 slams on the brakes and pivots right back to this brutal prophecy of total destruction. You have to ask, what is going on here?
And that's what makes it so jarring, you know? The whole section where Ezekiel was pronouncing judgment on Israel's enemies, that was supposed to be over and done with back in chapter 32. The story was supposed to be moving forward. So this new oracle, this divine smackdown on a nation called Edom, it feels like a misplaced file. It's this abrupt interruption just when the story of hope was supposed to kick off.
To solve this puzzle, we have to figure out who Edom was. Why did this one nation matter so much to an ancient Israelite that their destruction had to come before any talk of restoration could even begin?
See, Edom wasn't just any old enemy. In the biblical story, they were family who turned into the worst kind of traitor. They were descended from Esau, Jacob's brother. They were kin. But when Jerusalem fell to Babylon, when Israel was at its absolute lowest, what did Edom do? They didn't help. No, they acted like vultures, sweeping in to plunder the city and attack the refugees who were trying to escape. The prophet Obadiah talks about this betrayal in gut-wrenching detail, and Ezekiel picks up that same theme with absolute fury.
And man, the language here is just incredibly harsh. This is not a generic judgment. God's punishment is laid out as a direct, almost mathematical response to Edom's vicious opportunism. You showed no mercy, so you will get no mercy.
So you have to put yourself in their shoes. If you're an Israelite reading this in exile, this chapter doesn't feel out of place at all. It feels like justice. The punishment of the treacherous brother nation who kicked you when you were down, that had to happen first. It was the signal, the starting pistol, that God was finally about to turn the tables and start their comeback story.
And this setup leads to this absolutely powerful contrast in the very next chapter. Right after condemning the mountains of Edom to total desolation, Ezekiel turns to the mountains of Israel with this incredible promise of restoration.
The symmetry here is so intentional and so powerful. Everything that was just cursed in Edom gets flipped and becomes a blessing for Israel. One land is doomed to be empty forever, while the other is promised this miraculous Garden of Eden-like renewal, just overflowing with life. And this renewal, it isn't just about rebuilding some cities or planting a few fields. No, Ezekiel 36 promises this deep, internal, spiritual transformation for the people themselves. It's like a complete system reboot, taking out the hard, disobedient heart of stone and replacing it with a soft, responsive heart of flesh with God's own spirit living right inside them.
But here's the twist. The moment we solve that first puzzle, why the prophecy against Edom is right where it is, we immediately run into a second, much bigger, and way more complicated puzzle that people have been wrestling with for centuries.
And that's the big question, right? When did this happen? I mean, did the return from exile in the Old Testament really check all these boxes? Or is Ezekiel talking about something way off in the distant future, something that maybe still hasn't even happened yet? This one question has shaped centuries of debate. So let's look at the evidence. Ezekiel promises that God's own spirit will live inside his people, actually guiding them from within. So when did that happen?
Well, if you jump forward to the New Testament, the apostles point directly to the day of Pentecost, as in the events described in the book of Acts. They saw this as the moment that prophecy came true. When the Holy Spirit came on the believers in Jerusalem, for them, that was the dawn of the new age Ezekiel had been talking about.
And the prophecy went even deeper, right? It promised this fundamental change in human nature, from that hard, rebellious heart of stone to a soft, receptive heart of flesh.
And again, another New Testament writer, the Apostle Paul, he grabs this exact same imagery. He tells the believers in Corinth that they are a letter from Christ, but it's not written on stone tablets. No, it's written on tablets of human hearts. So for him, the prophecy was being fulfilled in real time in the lives of the early church. And that really challenges us to think about how these ancient texts are meant to be read.
And then the New Testament takes this whole idea of Edom and reinterprets it to make an even bigger, more inclusive point about God's plan for the world.
So, the prophet Amos connects the restoration of Israel with the conquest of their old enemy, Edom. Seems like a pretty straightforward prophecy about a national victory, right? But something really fascinating happens to this verse when we get to the New Testament.
Okay, so check this out. In Hebrew, the word for Edom and the word for mankind, which is Adam, are nearly identical. They're spelled with the same letters. So when James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, quotes this passage in Acts chapter 15, he's using the Septuagint, the popular Greek translation of the Old Testament. And in that version, a tiny change in a vowel sound turns the word from Edom to Adam.
Now, this isn't some mistake or a typo. It's a profound reinterpretation. The story is no longer just about Israel's conflict with one specific enemy. The whole prophecy expands. It becomes about God's plan for all of humanity, for all of Adam. Israel's restoration is now the very thing that leads to the world's restoration.
So, if some parts of Ezekiel's prophecy seem to be fulfilled in the New Testament, but other parts, like the land becoming a literal Garden of Eden, don't really seem to be, how do we make sense of all that? Well, this tension is what gives rise to three major ways of interpreting prophecy.
So you basically end up with three big camps. First, there's the amillennial view. They'd say this was all fulfilled spiritually in the past, through the church. Then you have the premillennial view, which says, nope, none of this has truly happened yet. It's all waiting for a future, literal fulfillment for the nation of Israel. And then there's a middle path, often called already but not yet, which says it's a mix of both. Many promises started to be fulfilled in the first century, but their ultimate, complete fulfillment is still to come.
And look, the goal here isn't to pick a winning team. It's to understand why these different views exist in the first place. They all start with the exact same text, but they answer that key question of fulfillment in very different ways. And that leads to these vastly different pictures of what the future holds.
And it's just wild to think that this whole massive 2,000-year-old conversation, it all started with a single puzzling chapter, a prophecy of doom that seemed completely out of place, but actually unlocked everything.
So, in the end, the puzzle of Ezekiel 35 isn't just about ancient history or some dusty theological debate. It forces all of us to ask a more personal question. How does my view of the future, whether I see these promises as past, future, or a bit of both, how does that shape how I understand my purpose and live my life right now?